In 1805, two admirals fought a war that was decided long before the guns fired. Nelson, a master of psychological warfare, weaponized confidence itself. Villeneuve, haunted by past defeats, became a prisoner of his own fear. When their fleets met at Trafalgar, it wasn't courage versus cowardice, it was clarity versus collapse. In 1805, Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson faced Vice Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve across the vast expanse of the Atlantic. Most historians focus on the culminating battle off Cape Trafalgar, but the real war wasn't fought with cannon. It was fought here. It was a war between a psychology of relentless, calculated aggression and one of crippling, fatalistic indecision. Victory would go to the commander who could master not only his own fleet, but the mind of his enemy. This was never a contest between equals. It was an asymmetric psychological conflict from the start. To understand the campaign, we must first understand the two minds at its center. Horatio Nelson was not merely a naval officer. He was a phenomenon. He had meticulously crafted a cult of personality, an aura of invincibility that was his single most potent weapon. His strategy was rooted in a concept I call calculated annihilation. He did not seek to simply defeat an enemy fleet. He sought to destroy it, to remove it from the board entirely. This wasn't reckless bravado, though he had that in spades. It was a cold, intellectual doctrine. Nelson understood a fundamental truth of asymmetric warfare. The psychological impact of a total victory echoes far longer than the victory itself. By annihilating an enemy, you terrorize the next enemy. You break their will before the first shot is even fired. His leadership style reinforced this. He famously briefed his captains, his band of brothers, on his unorthodox plans, ensuring they understood his intent, not just his orders. This decentralized command, it inoculated his fleet against the fog of war, transforming it from a rigid hierarchy into a network of like-minded predators, all empowered to seize the initiative. When Nelson's flag went up, it wasn't just a signal. It was a psychological trigger for ferocious, synchronized aggression. Then, there was Pierre-Charles Villeneuve, where Nelson's mind was primed for the offensive. Villeneuve's was pathologically defensive. He was a capable seaman, but he was also a profound risk-averse pessimist. He was haunted by the specter of the British Royal Navy, which had systematically dismantled French sea power for a decade, haunted by the crushing defeat at the Battle of the Nile, where Nelson had famously sailed into a supposedly secure anchorage and annihilated a French fleet. Villeneuve hadn't even been at the Nile, but its psychological shadow dictated his every move. His correspondence from 1805 is a study in cognitive dread. He writes to his superiors not of victory, but of the impossibility of victory. He complains of poor ships, untrained crews, and, above all, the terrifying superiority of the enemy. Here, we see a classic case of what psychologists call learned helplessness. Villeneuve had internalized the narrative of French inferiority to such a degree that he could no longer envision a scenario for success. His primary goal was not to achieve Napoleon's strategic objectives. It was simply to avoid Nelson. He was a commander already defeated in his own mind, terrified of the very admiral who was blamed. At that moment, hunting him, and Nelson, a masterful psychological predator, knew it. The year 1805 was meant to be Napoleon's triumph. His grand design was a masterpiece of strategic logistics. The Grande Armée, the most lethal fighting force in Europe, was massed at Boulogne, ready to cross the English Channel. All he needed was a diversion, He required a naval feint to draw the Royal Navy away, allowing his combined fleet of French and Spanish ships to seize control of the Channel for just long enough to ferry his army across. The man chosen to execute this linchpin maneuver was Pierre-Charles Villeneuve. The entire fate of the war rested on his shoulders. Here, we see the first crushing weight of pressure. Villeneuve was not an autonomous actor. He was a cog in a machine he barely understood. Commanded by an emperor who had no patience for naval limitations or psychological fragility, in March 1805, Villeneuve slipped Nelson's blockade of Toulon in a storm. For a moment, he was free, but this was not a victory. It was the beginning of the torment. He had escaped his jailer, but not the idea of him. Nelson, upon discovering Villeneuve's escape, was momentarily thrown. He guessed incorrectly that Villeneuve had sailed for Egypt, a move that revealed Nelson's own strategic obsession. But when he found no trace, he re-engaged his intellect and made a stunning, intuitive leap. He deduced Villeneuve's true destination: the West Indies. What followed was not a simple chase. It was one of the most relentless psychological pursuits in military history. Nelson, with a smaller, faster fleet, crossed the Atlantic in a fraction of the time. Villeneuve, meanwhile, arrived in the Caribbean as ordered, but he was paralyzed. He was supposed to be the aggressor, wreaking havoc on British colonies to draw the Royal Navy away. Instead, he was passive, waiting, his crews sickening, his ships degrading. He was a man perpetually looking over his shoulder. The very rumor of Nelson's arrival was enough to break him. When Villeneuve received word that Nelson's fleet, the bogeyman of the French Navy, was in the Caribbean, he did not stand and fight. He did not attempt to complete his mission. He panicked. He turned his combined fleet around and fled back to Europe, abandoning Napoleon's grand strategy entirely. Nelson's reputation had done what his cannons had not yet had the chance to. It had shattered his opponent's will. This is the very essence of a successful psychological operation. Nelson's physical pursuit was relentless, but it was the cognitive pressure, the constant, terrifying threat of his presence that truly corroded Villeneuve's resolve. The chase returned to European waters, off Cape Finisterre. Villeneuve's fleet, now numbering 20 ships of the line, blundered into a smaller British squadron of 15 ships under Sir Robert Calder. They fought an indecisive, messy battle in the fog. Neither side won a clear victory, but Villeneuve captured 2 British ships. By any objective measure, he had not been defeated. But for a mind like Villeneuve's, a draw is a catastrophe. His internal narrative of learned helplessness took over. This indecisive skirmish confirmed his deepest fear. If he could not decisively defeat a smaller British squadron, what hope did he have against the full might of Nelson, who was surely closing in? This was the culminating point of his psychological collapse. Napoleon's orders were explicit: sail north to Brest, join the rest of the fleet, and sweep the Channel. The invasion of England was still possible, but Villeneuve, besieged by his own cognitive biases, could not bring himself to take the offensive risk. He looked north, towards his objective, and saw only a glorious suicide. So, in the single most strategically disastrous decision of the entire campaign, he turned south. He fled to the port of Cadiz. It was an act of pure risk aversion. He was no longer a strategic admiral. He was a fugitive seeking sanctuary. He had chosen the illusion of safety in a fortified harbor over the demands of the mission. And in doing so, he had sailed his entire fleet directly into a trap that Nelson's psychological pressure had laid for him weeks in advance. The chase was over. The execution was about to begin for Villeneuve. Cadiz was a trap, not a refuge. Nelson established a loose, patient blockade, a psychological siege. He kept his main fleet just over the horizon, using a screen of fast frigates to observe the port. This was a deliberate choice. It projected an air of casual, arrogant confidence, all while Villeneuve's fleet was trapped, disintegrating from inactivity and political pressure. Napoleon's fury, when he learned of Villeneuve's retreat, was incandescent. His letters to the admiral were weapons in themselves, filled with accusations of cowardice and incompetence. "You are," he wrote, "avret. Here, we see a commander caught in an impossible cognitive bind. From the sea, he faced Nelson, an enemy he believed to be invincible. From the land, he faced an emperor who demanded a glorious and likely suicidal offensive." The final psychological blow landed in mid-October. Villeneuve learned that Napoleon had dispatched a new admiral to replace him. For a man of his time, this was the ultimate disgrace. A public branding of his failure. The fear of Nelson was now superseded by the terror of dishonor. On October 19, Villeneuve made his final decision. He ordered the combined fleet to sea. This was not a strategic move. It was an act of fatalism. He was not sailing out to win. He was sailing out to not be a coward in port when his replacement arrived. He had completely abdicated strategic agency as the combined fleet emerged. Nelson's mind was a model of clarity. His plan, the Nelson touch, was the very antithesis of Villeneuve's cognitive paralysis. It was an attack of pure, calculated audacity, designed to shatter the rigid enemy line by driving two columns directly through its center. But the Nelson touch was not merely a tactic. It was the operational end state of his entire psychological system. It was an attack that relied completely on the decentralized trust he had cultivated for years. He trusted his band of brothers to understand his intent, to find their own targets, and to execute with maximum aggression without needing micromanagement. When the fleets clashed at Trafalgar, it was a battle between two opposing psychologies. Nelson's fleet was a network of empowered, aggressive agents. Villeneuve's was a brittle, linear hierarchy commanded by a man already resigned to his own destruction. The result was exactly what Nelson had engineered. Not just a victory, but calculated annihilation. Villeneuve's worst fears, which had paralyzed him for a year, were finally and brutally realized. Villeneuve was trapped between two impossible forces: Napoleon's demands from land and Nelson's pressure at sea. Facing this immense psychological pincer, could any commander have avoided cognitive collapse? Or was Villeneuve's fatalistic mindset the true architect of his own destruction? Share your analysis in the comments.